We are really lucky that Heather McCargo, way up in Maine, not that far, but you're pretty far up there, has kindly agreed to speak to us tonight about her really cool program and share a lot of her expertise. Heather is going to talk about the life cycles of some New England native plants and how we can change our landscape practices to support wild plant reproduction, pollinators, and wildlife. She'll demonstrate outdoor seeding methods, seed sowing methods to help increase native plant populations. And growing native plants from seed is a great way to protect the genetic diversity of our native flora and produce an abundance of plants inexpensively. So Heather founded the Wild Seed Project in 2014 and served as executive director from then till 2021. Now she focuses on expanding their native seed collection and propagation center. Heather is an educator with 30 years experience in plant propagation, landscape design, horticulture, and conservation. She was a former head plant propagator at the New England Wildflower Society, which is now the Native Plant Trust, Garden in the Woods during the 1990s. She's also worked at several landscape architecture planning firms specializing in ecological design and has contributed to research projects with USAID, the National Gardening Association, and oh man, I forgot what MOFGA is. Is that Maine something or other?
Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners.
Thank you. MOFGA. She has lectured nationally and is widely published in journals and magazines, including the Brooklyn Botanical Garden's Growing from Seed, Horticulture magazine, American Nurseryman, Ecological Landscape Alliance, and many others. Heather designed the master plan for the medicinal gardens at Avena Botanicals in Rockport and was the creator of the Bay School Agricultural Arts program in Blue Hill. She has a BA in plant ecology from Hampshire College and an MA from the Conway School of Landscape Design. And I think at that point, her talk is titled Life Cycles, Landscape Practices, and Growing Native Plants from Seed by Heather McCargo.
Well, thank you, everyone. The organization I founded is called Wild Seed Project, and we're in our 9th year, and we are located in Portland, Maine. And I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania originally, and have also lived in a lot of other places. So I do know, I haven't spent a lot of time in Maryland, but I have spent a lot of time throughout the East Coast. And particularly when I was at Garden in the Woods in the 1990s, we had grew a lot of plants from the mid-Atlantic and Southeast place. So all the species I'm talking about today grow in Maryland. But I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to show you some of the different flowering, seed ripening, and germination needs of a variety of different examples of native plants. And I'm going to begin with spring wildflowers, which are the slower and more challenging species, and then move on to the more easy ones. Before I start, though, Wild Seed Project is partnering with the indigenous people of Maine, the Wabanaki, and we are working on a land acknowledgement statement, which we're now reading at the beginning of all our programs, just in respect to the indigenous people who were the first people on this land. So I'm just going to read this short draft because I don't have it memorized. Wild Seed Project is located within the ancestral Wabanaki territory now called Maine. We recognize and honor the tribes of the Wabanaki, called the people of the dawn, the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy peoples. The Wabanaki people have been the stewards of this land and the plants growing here for generations. We recognize their inherent sovereignty and support their continuing efforts to protect the land, water, plants, and creatures. The resources we share are gathered from many teachers, both human and non-human. We encourage you to learn more about the historical and present-day relationships of the indigenous people in the communities and places where you live, and enjoy join us in supporting their efforts to protect the land, water, and creatures amongst us. And this is just a picture from the Camden Hills in Maine, just to give you a view of the land that I'm coming from. But like I said, I have a lot of experience up and down the East Coast. Now I'll get started on walking you through the life cycles of some of our great indigenous plants. And in this picture, you're looking at trout lily. Some people call it dogtooth violet, and also wood anemone. The trout lily has just finished blooming here. That'll probably give you an indication of how far behind we are on spring in Maine. And the wood anemone, the little white flower in front, is still blooming here. And both of those are two true spring ephemerals, which means they really complete their life cycle before the tree canopy has leafed out. They come up really early, live their life, produce seeds, and go dormant by late spring. So the trout lily is a great example of our slow-growing woodland lily species. So after that flower is pollinated by early spring native bees, a small green pod formed, is maybe a half an inch at the most across. And then the plants start to go dormant. The leaves start to turn tan and then disappear. And even the stalk with the seed pod in it, by the time it is ripe, it has completely flopped over and is laying on the ground. And it turns from green to sort of a tannish color. And then one day it splits and the seeds pop out, and the seeds are dispersed by ants, which I'll talk in a little more detail in a minute. And that species takes 12 to 15 years from when the seeds ripen to when it will produce a flowering plant. So this is a really slow growing plant. It does also reproduce vegetatively, but it's one of our slowest wildflowers to grow from seed. And when you see this plant for sale, you really need to be careful that it's been propagated. Like many of the spring woodland wildflowers, those seeds can't dry out. They really have to, the ants carry them off and deposit them under the leaf litter. And like I said, it's typically 2 years before they germinate, and then 12 to 15 years before they ripen. The wood anemone, what happens after that white flower is pollinated again by different species of native bees, a lot of small ones on that species. I do see big bumblebees on the trout lily. Then you get a cluster of little green fruits that when they ripen, they just kind of fall off the plants, and they are also ant dispersed. Bloodroot, that's another one of our really early spring blooming wildflowers, the typical in rich deciduous forest. And when it's blooming, like in this picture, the flowers are about 6 to 8 inches tall and maybe 1.5 to 2 inches apart. And then the petals fall, both bumblebees and little bees, sometimes even little flies and gnats pollinate it. Then the petals fall off, the foliage emerges, and where the flower was, you get a green kayak-shaped seed pod. It's probably ripening where you are now in Maryland, because up here in Maine, we're about a couple weeks away, so we're a few weeks behind you. But that seed pod is about 2 inches long and, like I said, kayak shaped. And then when they ripen, it splits, and it happens quickly. Like within a couple hours, it will split. The seeds will fall out, and the ants will immediately appear and carry them off. And what the ant does thereafter, there's a little fleshy protrusion on the seeds called an aril that is high in fats, and that's what they like to eat and why they're carrying the seed off. And then they take it to their nest, eat that little fleshy protrusion, and then discard the seed in the ant equivalent of a compost bin, and that moist environment sort of under the leaf litter down in the soil is the perfect place for those seeds to stay moist. And then with the bloodroot, they also typically, they don't bloom they don't germinate the next spring. It's actually the second spring before you'll see a small little leaf appear, and then usually about 3 to 4 years before you'll reach a blooming size plant. Purple trillium, or all the trillium species. So if you look at, so this is the most common one in Maine, purple trillium. And it, unlike the other species, this one, like a lot of plants that have this sort of brownish purple colored petals on the flowers, is actually pollinated by fungal gnats. But most of the other trilliums are just pollinated by different species of bees. In Maine, these aren't blooming till early May, but I would imagine where you are, it's early to mid-April when your trilliums are blooming. And then it takes about 3 months after the bloom before the seeds are ripened. So in this center picture, you can see what a trillium seed pod looks like, and it's kind of a fleshy, fruity feeling pod, and it's about 1 inch across. Most of the species have a green pod. The painted trillium and the purple trillium have this maroon or reddish pod. And when they ripen, and up here in Maine, it's usually late July. So where you are, I would guess it could be early July. What happens is that pod is very firm, but then all of a sudden, in one day it turns soft and falls off the plants. And you can see on the right, the pod opens up, and you'll see the brown seeds with that creamy white little protrusion on each seed. That's the aril. That's what the ants are after. And it's amazing how quickly the ants get there. So, if you're interested in propagating these plants, you've really got to be checking as they get close to being ripe. You've got to check them every day, otherwise you'll miss them. And since we can see a close-up of a seed in this picture, just to remember that a seed is an embryonic plant, with a root and a shoot, and then some food, which is often starchy or sometimes oily. In our food plants, those are the parts that we eat, and then a protective cover called a seed coat. The seeds form in the ovary of the mother plant. So with this trillium, that seed pod actually is the ovary, and that's part of the mother plant. But the seeds inside, they're what represent the next generation and are the result of sexual reproduction, the cross-pollination, usually, with many plants happening with the insects who help them pollinate. And each one of those seeds will be a genetically unique individual, even with only 2 different mother plants. So again, if you think of let's take a fruit that we eat, a blueberry, the blueberry that we love the taste of, that is the ovary, that's from the mother plant. It's the teeny little seeds inside that represent the next generation. And with these slow-going woodland wildflowers, particularly the spring ephemerals and the lily species, they're all the ones that are dispersed by ants and typically have seeds that have to be sown fresh right when you collect them. So that's the reason you're never going to buy packages of these seeds of some of these slow-growing woodland wildflowers. Another example is foam flower, Tiarella cordifolia. So that's just blooming here in Maine now, and I don't know, it's probably gone by for you all. And they go to seed pretty quickly, especially I find they stop blooming as soon as you get a hot day. The heat seems to be what switches them past the bloom to producing seeds. And you can see a few small pictures on the screen of the where the seeds are forming. It's about about 1/8 of an inch long, little papery green pod, and then inside it are tiny little black seeds that also have a tiny little aril, but it's so small you practically need to look at it with a magnifying glass to be able to see the aril. So when these seeds disperse, the ants also carry them off, and to propagate them, you need to sow these fresh. So again, this is not one that you're going to easily be able to, get a package of Tiarella seeds and sow them yourself. You sort of need access to the fresh seed, and you sow them right away. And when we get to the end of the talk, I'll walk you through more the simple methods I recommend. But all these ones we've looked at, I'm starting to keep my eye out. Usually some of the first seeds to ripen are Tiarella is actually one of them, and I'll be prepared to sow them right away. Now, there are lots of particularly our woodland plants that are dependent on, a relationship with the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. And the lady slipper orchids are a classic example of that. They must have this, certain species, they're the Orchidaceae mycorrhizal fungi for their whole life cycle. For the seeds to germinate, for the plants to live, they need that specific species of fungi. And so that's the reason these are the ones that are really difficult to propagate. And, there's some of the orchids, can be cloned, but then you don't have any genetic diversity. So you're not really doing anything to support these plants ecologically in the wild, or to have resilient garden plants when you're just cloning, because they have no genetic diversity. But so the orchids, so some of these I like to tell people, like the pink lady slipper orchid, if you're lucky enough to see that or have it on your own land, appreciate it as a wild plant that doesn't want to be tamed. Now, it's a lot of our acid woodland plants that also need, have this mycorrhizal relationship. For instance, the rhododendrons, all our rhododendrons and azaleas have their own set of mycorrhizal species that really helps them thrive in the wild. Same with wintergreen. It's not hard to germinate and grow wintergreen seeds, but for them to establish healthily in the, sustainably in the landscape, they really need that mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. Also the blueberries all have their own ericaceous mycorrhizal fungi. So if you've had trouble with some of those plants, that really is the reason they often don't thrive in people's typical yards. And until you can create more healthy woodland soil with the correct, canopy and understory shrubs, which will make the environment that those fungi will appear. Now I'm going to move on to some of the easier to collect the seeds, but that they still must be sown fresh. So this is marsh marigold, and typically bloom for about 3 weeks. It's most often a wetland plant, although quite adaptable in just moist garden soil. And after the flowers are pollinated by native bees, that you will then get this cluster of greens. It's a star-shaped pod, and on a picture on the top right, you can see where it's opened up, and it then splits along the seams, and it has green seeds inside. And you need to collect those seeds and sow them immediately. Don't let them dry out. I like to sow them in a maybe 6 or 8 inch pot. You can sow them densely, and then put that pot in a dish of water and put them in the shade. And you leave them uncovered. You don't cover them with anything, but they need to be not in the direct sunlight. So in the wild, where this usually happens, these are often growing, in stream sides and wetlands. And so by later in the spring, when the seeds have ripened, here in Maine, the seeds usually ripen in early June. So yours, I'd imagine, would be ripening now. But what happens is they fall off and land on the damp mud underneath the leaves or under the canopy of the trees. And that's the perfect environment for them to germinate. And these will typically germinate within a couple weeks or a month. And you can have nice little plants by September. Some other examples of spring species that have seeds when they ripen that they stay green are hepatica. They are very much like that wood anemone where it's a little cluster of green seeds, and if you just go brush your hand against it, they will come off when they're ripe and you need to sow them right away. Also, groundsel or pachyra, those don't have green seeds, but they fluff out, or willow, those are all getting ready. Those are probably ripening now for you all down there, I would imagine. And you see this sort of just looks like cottony stuff, and you need to get them right away and sow them. Same technique, put them in a big pot, in a dish of water, and sprinkle the seeds on the top of the soil and put them in the shade. With willow, once they germinate, you want to give them some sunlight, but until they germinate, put them in the shade. And same with the pachyra, they will germinate within a couple of weeks often too. Hepatica, not true. Those won't germinate till a year later, sometimes too. Another one of our great woodland wild and open area wildflowers are all the species of violets. In Maine, we have about 25 native species. You probably have more farther south because there tends to be more diversity of species the farther south you go. They're pollinated by early spring bees. They also are great host plant for several butterfly species. But after the flower goes by, you'll see it's the shape of where the pod formed. It's usually about, less than half an inch long, and it's green and it stays like this. And then a couple days before it's ripe, the pod suddenly points up and then it splits open. And inside you'll see these golden brown seeds. They also have a little arrow on them. So ants do disperse these seeds. They also can spring out from the plant. But unlike all the other species we've seen so far, these seeds you can store dry. You can collect them in a paper bag and then just wait until later in the fall to sow them because they do need a winter cold period to germinate. One of the weird things though about violets is they also have a secondary strategy to produce seeds for years when they don't have good pollination. And I would guess it's because them being spring bloomers, maybe they've had, over the millions of years these species have been around, had a lot of wet springs where the bees can't fly. And so this picture on the right, it's what happens sort of in early summer is it's like a peanut where a flowering stalk will appear and then it will turn around and burrow underground. So you never see a flower. Instead, it burrows underground. And so it does not get pollinated and it produces seeds. They look exactly like the other ones. Once they're ripened, they come up above ground and split open. But those seeds are all literally cloned of that mother plant. So very unusual, but you can collect those seeds and store them dry in a paper bag and then sow them later in the fall in the methods I'm going to show you. Wild geranium. This is a lovely spring wildflower. It's just started to bloom here in Maine, and it's attractive to both bumblebees and hummingbirds actually love this plant. And what's tricky about geranium, they have a couple week bloom period with staggered blooms, which means staggered seed ripening. And you get the picture on the right, the image on the right, you can see the ripened seed pod, and you can see it has 5 little nutlets with, it's why it's called crane's bill, because it has this long peak. And they're green until all of a sudden in one day, within a couple of hours, it turns from green to black and the seeds spring off from the plant. So when my busy seed collecting season, I have to check these plants, several times a day to get a lot of seed. And I collect them over a 2-week period. So you can store those seeds dry and then sow them outdoors in the fall, and they'll germinate. And I'll show you a picture of this in a little bit, but it's collecting them that's tricky because they spring off from the plants. Then there are other ones that are tricky just because they're so teeny. We call these bluets in Maine. I know where I'm from, outside of Pittsburgh, they were called Quaker ladies, but this is a wildflower that's only a couple inches tall. And people often, if they have this in their lawn, they'll let it bloom, but as soon as they don't see the flowers anymore, they tend to mow them. And it really takes a couple of weeks after the flowers have finished before the little seed pods are ripened. And just like the tiny flowers, the seed pod is very tiny. It's, on a 1.5-inch stalk. It's a little green pod that when it's ripened, it turns tan and papery-ish. And then there's tiny, tiny little seeds inside of that. So I have to come out with scissors and a white paper envelope to collect these seeds. Amazingly, though, a couple little pods will produce quite a few seeds, and it's very easy to just sprinkle them in some, I like to mix these in a very gritty potting soil, and you can either store them dry and sow them in the late fall or early spring. So it's not hard to grow, but you better mark, if you were lucky enough to have some of these, you've got to mark them when they're blooming, otherwise you'll never be able to find them. Now I'm going to move into the easier species to collect the seeds of. This is red columbine. This is now just blooming here in Maine. And it's one of the first of the spring blooming wildflowers to have the more typical of the later season plants, which is a seed pod that turns from green to dry and papery. So after it's pollinated by hummingbirds, you will get these green pods that face upright. They're kind of spidery looking, and then they will turn tan and papery, and you'll see them split along the inner seams the way that marsh marigold was, and you'll see shiny little black seeds inside. And this one plant like this will produce copious amounts of seeds. This is a great one to let it seed around your yard, because it will choose the best place for it to grow. It hates mulch or bark mulch. Like where this plant grows in the wild typically is rocky ledges. In Maine, you can see it in rich rocky ledges in the forest, and you can also see it on the rocky ledges on the coast where it's getting the salt spray, and it's the ledges where the crown doesn't get buried under leaf litter. So these seeds you can store dry, and then they need a cold period before they germinate. So you can just hold on to them in a paper bag or an envelope. Make sure it's got tight seams in the bottom because they're small seeds. Now I'm going to show you some examples of some fleshy fruits that have seeds that you can store dry. So this is wild strawberry. This is an excellent native ground cover and edible plant. And so when the fruit is ripe, like you would want to eat it, that's when I collect the seeds. And what I have found is the simplest way to separate the seeds from this fruit is to take the fruits and smear them on a piece of cardboard and let them dry for at least a couple days. And then you can scrape them off with a knife or some sort of heavy straight edge thing, and put them in a paper envelope or bag and store them dry for later sowing. Jack in the Pulpit is another one. And I heard somebody say that you have green, I know you have green dragon down there. I'm very envious. Both of these, this is one of my favorite wildflowers. They're both, some of the northernmost species in what's mostly a tropical family, the Eracema, the arum family. And the Jack in the Pulpit have separate male and female flowers, and you can't see, when you just look at the flower, you can't tell because the actual flowers are in that light green striped area down below. You'd have to cut it open to see, but it's very easy to tell after the flowers go by, because if it's male, you don't see any fruits forming, but if it's female, you'll get these emerald green shiny fruits that when they're ripe, they turn bright red. And that's when you can collect the fruits. And I like to squeeze the seed out, you know, as a general rule of thumb. If it's got a fleshy fruit, remove the fruit, because sometimes, not always, sometimes that fruit has germination inhibitors, and you'll have much better germination if you remove the fleshy fruit. There are exceptions to that, and I have sown Jack in the Pulpit fruits with the flesh on them, and they have germinated fine. And at a little while later, I'll show you what first year seedlings of this plant looks like. One of the things that's really neat about Jack in the Pulpit is they can switch back and forth from year to year, from being male or female. There's only, you know, other species that do that are famous for that, or like date palms can switch back and forth from year to year. And probably it has to do with, if they had a stressful year, they'll be male the next year, because it takes more energy to produce seeds than it does to produce the pollen. So you can just, these fruits, interestingly, these seeds are some of the last to germinate in the spring. They really wait till the heat of summer before they will germinate. And again, probably hinting at its more tropical roots. Okay, now I'm going to show you some fleshy fruits that the seeds must be sown right away to have good germination. So this is really typical of our viburnum species and shrub and tree dogwoods. The picture on the top, that's the pagoda dogwood. Lots of those species have these very frothy flowers that are pollinated by different species of bees, and then they have fleshy fruit. So the picture on the bottom on the left, you're looking at nannyberry. Those fruits aren't quite ripe. They turn from green to orange to pink to then black when they're ripe. The middle one's highbush cranberry, and the right is silky dogwood. So as soon as those fruits have ripened, I collect them and I put them typically in a Ziploc bag, and then I start to macerate them, squish them to kind of break apart the fruit, and I let them ferment in that bag for at least a week. And I keep mushing the bag to help separate the pulp from the seeds. Then what I do is empty that bag out in a big bowl or bucket, and the seeds will sink to the bottom and the pulp will be in there. Sometimes if the pulp's sticking on, I use a blender stick that I've dulled the blades, and that can help separate the fruit on ones that haven't separated. And then I decanter it off. Make sure that you don't do this in a sink, because do it over another bowl in case some good seeds get poured off by mistake. And so then you clean the seeds and then you sow them right away. Don't let them dry out. And in Maine, some of these species, some of the viburnums particularly, because we're so far north, those fruits, by the time they've ripened in late August or September, it can already be cool here. And they often have an immature embryo that needs another month or a couple months of warm weather, and then it needs to go through a winter cold period, and they will germinate in the spring. So some of these species for us up here, if you sow them right after you've cleaned them and the weather's cool in the fall, they will take 2 years to germinate. That's probably less true for you down there. I can sometimes trick them by once I've cleaned them, I just keep the seeds moist for about a month and keep them on my desk, and then sow them and put them outside. And I'll show you what a pot of the silky dogwood looks like in a minute. And then all of our nuts, oaks, hickories, this is hazelnut in this picture. These nuts are all hydrophilic. They can't dry out. So the trick with them is, well, particularly with the hazelnut, is as soon as they're ripe, the squirrels and chipmunks figure it out before you do if you're not on your toes and eat them all up. So you really have to be prepared to collect them. And they go from being this sort of green leafy covering on the hazelnut to it gets a little bit more papery, and then you'll see the ripe brown seeds inside. And then with acorns and hickory nuts, all of those, you want to collect them as soon as they drop to the ground, so that you get ahead of the squirrels and chipmunks, or don't take all of them, they need them too. And then they can't dry out. So whatever, I frequently get people who tell me, oh, I collected a bunch of acorns. How do I sow them? And I said, where are they? And they said, oh, they've been sitting in a bowl in my kitchen for a couple weeks, or I left them in my car. You will kill them. You need to put them in a Ziploc bag right away so they don't dry out. Then with the hickory nuts or the hazelnuts, remove the husk. And then I like to put them in a bowl or bucket of water, because if any of the seeds have been eaten by a little weevil or an insect, which is usually a native species that makes them their home, those seeds won't germinate. So just keep all the ones that sink, and then put them in a Ziploc bag. And the white acorn, in the white acorn side of the family, the white oak, those all put down a root immediately. So you have to sow them and put them outside immediately. However, with all the nuts, the big issue is the squirrels and chipmunks, that they will just rip them out of your pots right away if you haven't protected them. So you really need to make a wire cage. If you've collected some and you're not prepared to sow them because you haven't made your wire cage, you can put them in the Ziploc bag and put them in the refrigerator, and then wait till you've made your rodent-proof cage. Really critical. These are all really easy species to grow from seed, perfect for community groups and school groups or anyone to do, but you do have to beware of the rodents. The other trees that have seeds that are ripening now that you need to sow right away are the red maple and silver maple. Those drop their seeds in the spring, and they also cannot dry out. I mean, it's okay to keep them in a Ziploc bag for a couple of days or a week and then sow them, but they cannot dry out those seeds. You will kill them. The sugar maple and the mountain maple and the straight maple, those seeds all ripen in the fall. And the same thing, you need to sow them right away. Don't let them dry out, but they're not hard to grow. Okay, now I'm going to move into the easier species. These are the ones, if this is new to you, these are some of the species to begin with. And they're all, this next group I'm going to look at all have seeds that ripen in later, mid to late summer or fall, and can be harvested and stored dry in a paper bag and then sowed outside in the methods I'm going to show you in a minute. So this is wild iris, for instance. For us here in Maine, these seeds tend to ripen in late August or September. So I imagine for you, it might be earlier down there. And they get a 2 to 3 inch green pod that splits from the tip, and you'll see all these lovely brown, tightly packed seeds inside, and you can just collect them, put them in a paper bag, and then sow them outdoors in the fall. And one pod will have 100 or more seeds. And so from one plant, from one flower stalk, you can, grow 100 genetically diverse individuals. That doesn't happen when you take divisions off an iris. All the milkweed species, they, along with being great pollinator plants for lots of pollinating insects, not just the monarch butterfly, but I get all kind of great insects at my different milkweed species. But those pods, which are probably the most recognizable to almost everyone, they're green. But when they're ripened, what happens is they turn from green to being, the common milkweed, they got kind of a dingy grayish tan. The swamp milk, some of the other milkweed species get more of a papery tan, but the pod splits, and the ideal is to get there right on the day it's splitting, because then it's easiest to just pinch the end of the pod and fleck the seeds off, instead of, if you've waited till they're fluffing out, it's a little harder to separate the seeds from the silk. How you can easily do it is just put them in a bag and shake it very vigorously, and the seeds will fall off. And so then you can just store those seeds dry and sow them outdoor in the fall. And particularly with the common milkweed or any of the meadow milkweed species, this is the reason you need to wait till late fall before mowing those meadows. A lot of these species we're looking at, the seeds ripen late into the fall. Cardinal flower. This is pollinated by hummingbirds. You do also see bumblebees sometimes coming, and they actually cheat and cut a little hole at the base of the corolla to get the nectar. They don't actually pollinate it, they're just after the nectar. But after the seeds, because they flower, from the bottom up, they also produce the seeds that way. So the little green seed pod, when it's ripe, it gets little holes in it, and it's tan color, and you'll see a lot of teeny little brown seeds inside, and you can collect them and put them in a paper bag. Where they want to germinate in the wild, if you look in this picture across from it, you can see that damp mud. That's the perfect environment. They're tiny seeds. Typically, tiny seeds are just, need to be sown on the soil surface and not buried at all. They need that light to germinate. So you can sow these. I just store them dry in a paper bag and then sow them in the fall on the soil surface. Again, I'll walk you through that in a minute. But one plant will produce copious amounts of seed. It's really quite amazing. Blue vervain, a wet meadow or roadside ditch species, again, often gets mowed away by the mowing crews before the seeds have ripened. For us, these flower late July, early August, so the seeds aren't ripening until October. So, 2 to 2.5 months before the seed is ripening. So a lot of our native plants are not reproducing because they're getting mowed after they bloom, but before the seeds have ripened. So these seed pods, they turn brown and they split, and they're a little brown seed. They're quite small. They're rod shaped. They're very easy to grow from seed, but they require a winter outdoors to germinate. Now, we have lots of really easy species, and those are the great places to begin with. And we even have some like the asters, goldenrods. We have lots of those that make great garden plants. And then the coneflowers, too, are some of the easy species. And the black-eyed coneflower and our aster species, they don't actually require a winter cold period outside. You can sow them in the spring. However, you will have earlier germination and better germination if you sow them outdoors in the late fall, early winter. So you get better germination with the methods I'm going to show you in a second. But before that, I want to just tell a cautionary tale. And it has to do with why you can't collect seeds from cultivars. And my cautionary tale is around the purple coneflower. Because in 1990, right, the first year I became propagator at Garden in the Woods, the Botanic Garden of the Native Plant Trust, that year, this plant won the Perennial Plant of the Year award with the Perennial Plant Association. And so up until that point, all the Echinacea purpurea that you saw looked like this. The classic dangling down petals, the orange brownish cone in the center, varying shades of pink, and anywhere from 2 to 4 feet high. And everybody, people who grew it were perennial gardeners and herbalists and knew it and loved it as a super great, tough plant. Well, after it got the attention of the Perennial Plant Association, all this plant breeding started to happen. There's about a dozen Echinacea species native from the Prairie Straits through Eastern North America, and they both hybridize different species together. And other more modern methods of plant breeding can include radiating the seeds or treating them with chemicals that cause them to mutate and sometimes make these unusual forms of plants. And so now when you go to a garden center, you've all seen it, all these unusual forms. That one in the center is even a partially double flowered one. And what happens with the double flower is the stamens and pistils, which are the sex organs of the plant, those mutate and look like, on this one, it's like little teeny petals, sometimes, like a double flower, fully double flower. That's where all the stamens and pistils have mutated, and there's no pollen, there's no nectar, no seeds are formed. This is not what I want to see happen with all of our native plants, because you take a plant that was a great pollinator plant and it produced a lot of seed that was valuable for wildlife and make it sexually dysfunctional, basically. So this is not a judgment on looks. It's fine to think these different cultivars are beautiful. However, it is not beneficial to supporting our native species, their genetic diversity, and their role in the landscape. So I'm just going to show you a couple other examples. Foam flower, Tiarella, again, the straight species on the right. That plant also in the last 30, 40 years has really gotten popular with plant breeding, and it's hard to find the straight species anymore. And in fact, a lot of Tiarella has been hybridized with the Heuchera family. And you can see this picture on the left. There are all these different purple and even yellow foliage forms. And, so those won't even produce seed. They're hybrids between two individuals. All of our native plants serve as host plants to different species of butterfly and moth, the Lepidoptera. That's a big part of what makes them such valuable in the ecosystem. In the same way that the monarch butterfly needs milkweed as a host plant for its caterpillars, for it to lay its eggs and have them nourished on the leaves. The same is true of Tiarella and every other native species. So these purple foliaged ones, the Iva, I don't know what species of Lepidoptera uses Tiarella, but if it were to lay its eggs on the purple foliage ones, when those caterpillars hatch, they won't eat the purple foliage one. That chemical that's in it, and the anthocyanin, is a deterrent and tastes bad to them. So this is not what we want to have happen to our native plants. Another example, this is yellow bush honeysuckle. Diarvilla lonicera is the species we have in New England. It has these small yellow flowers that are pollinated by bumblebees, and then after it blooms, you can tell which ones have been pollinated because they turn orange after they've been pollinated. These bloom in late spring here in Maine, and those are some of the last seeds that I collect in November. So 6 months for the flowers to produce ripe seeds. But, when the plant leaves out in the spring, it often has a reddish tinge to the foliage. And that's true of a lot of our native plants, particularly the woody plants, where that reddish chemical, that anthocyanin, it's a deterrent for browsing, bunny rabbits and deer and insects just in the first week or two that the plant leafing out, probably because it's so desperate to photosynthesize, it wants to deter insects, and then that purple color goes away. But what is horticulture favoring? These unusual foliage forms of our native plants. And so, for instance, I found in a nursery this red, in the middle of the summer, this red foliage form of the bush honeysuckle. And I happen to know that bush honeysuckle is the host plant for 5 different Lepidoptera species. So again, they won't make use of these red foliage forms. The only way to keep that trait is to clone them, so no genetic diversity. So that's what we don't want to have happen to native plants, and why we want lots of people sowing the native seeds. Seed-grown plants are genetically diverse, and it's what will make them resilient, because Each individual is different, and some of the offspring will like the hotter, wetter, or hotter, drier climate that we have coming towards us. So it's central to the mission of Wild Seed Project's work, demystifying native seed sowing. And there's lots of great free information on our website. But critical to it is one of the first things I quickly realized we need to do was offer good genetically diverse native seeds for sale. I was an expert in how to collect and handle the seeds. So that's a big part of our mission-driven work, and also to teach people how to do it themselves. So, and I frequently get people saying, oh, I'm so glad that Wild Seed Project's getting people to save the seeds. And I like to say, I'm not trying to get people to save the seed. I'm trying to get people to sow the seeds. And in fact, sowing the seeds is the first step to learning about seed collecting and saving the seeds, because then you watch the plant grow and get to see its whole life cycle. So now I'm going to show you how I like to have people do it. And I like to have you sow the seeds in pots or flats. You know, these are 4-inch square heavy duty plastic pots. Clay pots actually work really well. And they're often free because nurseries don't use them anymore. So if you can get your hands on clay pots, that's ideal for sowing the seeds in. I like to have people sow the seeds in good organic potting soil that's, got some compost in it. I discourage people from buying potting soil that's been inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. I'm very concerned, that's been a big hype now in the nursery horticulture world, but it's only promoting the mycorrhizal fungi that can be mass produced in a laboratory, and it's not necessarily a species from your local area. And I think it's risky. And if you just have a compost-based soil and have live soil, if you don't use chemicals in your garden, you will have soil that is beneficial to good bacteria and fungi and all those great creatures in the soil. But you can there's so many good brands of organic potting soil now. Get some of them, put them in the pot, and then you sow the seeds in the pot, and you can sow the seeds very densely. These are all of our native species. These are all perennials. They don't grow. If you're experienced, vegetable gardener, if you had your tomatoes or broccoli too close together, they'd grow too quickly and crowd each other out. But that's just not true with the native seeds. In fact, I like to say native seeds they're like teenagers. They seem to germinate really well closely together. So sow them thickly. Now, people often say, why can't I just sow them directly outside in my garden or yard? And the reason is there's every patch of earth has so many weed seeds in it. And the weeds will grow much faster than the native species. So if you sow them in pots, you will know there are no weeds in there, and you will have a label right there, and you'll be able to watch what they look like when they germinate. So after you sow the seeds, you then cover the seeds with coarse sand. You can just get it at any hardware store. Sometimes it's called coarse builder sand. It's the wintertime, just make sure it doesn't have de-icing salt in it. It often will say for landscaping on the bag. Play box sand isn't ideal because it's been sifted till it's all teeny fine sand. It's better to have sand that's coarser and grittier. And a good rule of thumb is you cover the seeds to the depth of the thickness of the seeds. So if they're tiny seeds like the black-eyed coneflower and the less, you sprinkle the sand very lightly. Same with asters, because the seeds on asters are very small. Something like the milkweed, you'd easily do 1/4 inch of sand. Then you carry the pots outside. And I like to have people do this in December is a great time to do it. And I'd imagine where you are, or January even, where you are down south, it's probably risky to do it in October or even early November with warm weather in the fall. So you carry it outside. I like to put find a flat place in the shade and cover it with wire mesh that will keep the dog or cats or squirrels from going and digging in there. And then no matter what the weather, freeze, thaw, rain, sleet, our native seeds and particularly the wild seeds, they need that fluctuating winter temperatures to break through the heavy seed coat. It's much more effective than sowing the seeds in a pot and putting it in your refrigerator to stratify the seed. Your refrigerator is 40 degrees. That there's not the freeze and thaw. It's the freeze and thaw that breaks up the heavy seed coat. And then what happens is, starting in early spring, species start to germinate. And some of those woodland wildflowers that we saw, like trillium and trout lily and bloodroot, those will, and some of the viburnums, they will germinate really early, like when it's still regularly frosty at night. So in Maine, that's in March. You guys, it might be, for us, it's late March. It would probably be earlier. The fall and winter sown asters and penstemons, they will germinate really early. And so this is what it starts to look like. Then here it is. This is now May. And you can see in these little 4-inch pots, you can see I have at least 100, if not more, seedlings of these different species in each pot. And so, with these 4-inch pots, in one square foot, you can have 9 different pots, 9 different species, and hundreds of seeds germinating. Then what I like to have people do, people are very anxious to then plant these out right away. And know, as you come into spring, more mature plants in your landscape will typically outcompete most of these, with the exception of black-eyed coneflower. That one you can plant in the garden by late spring, but all the rest of the species, if you're a homeowner or new to this, what I like to have people do is take that small pot and just tip the whole thing out when it starts to seem crowded, and just put it in a much bigger pot. Something like milkweed, I'd put it in a gallon-sized pot, maybe even 2-gallon-sized pot, and you will get 1 to 2 foot of growth in that over the summer. And you can keep those pots where you will keep them watered over the summer, and you won't have to worry about them getting crowded out in the landscape by weeds. And then wait and plant them out in the garden in September or even probably October where you are. Now, there are some species that like to not always cooperate, or that have their own timetable. This is the wild geranium that we saw earlier. And so these seeds, I sowed them out in late December, and some wild seeds, and it really varies from year to year with some of these species. Some years you will have only maybe a small percentage or a third of them will germinate. So with this pot of wild geranium, I would say about a quarter of them germinated the next spring. And then so that's what you see, those bigger leaves. So I just kept them in the pot, and then the second spring, they all germinated. Other years, they will all germinate the next spring. It just varies. And this is a good strategy in a wild plant to have staggered germination, because who knows what the weather is going to be in, at least in New England, we've had a lot of really dry springs. And so if a wild plant, if all its seeds germinate that spring and then there's a drought, they all will die. Whereas if only some of them germinate, those seeds will still be around the next year. This is the Jack in the Pulpit, what first year seedlings of Jack in the Pulpit look like. So that leaf is about 1 inch across, and you can see there's about 30 plants in this little pot. I then move this pot into a 8-inch round pot and let it grow on for the summer, and wait till the next year to divide them up. Or, I might even choose in the fall to go plant, if I was just doing this as a homeowner and not as a nursery, might just take this whole pot of seedlings in September and plant it in a location in the garden to let it grow on for a couple of years, as opposed to dividing them all up. Because Jack in the Pulpits, can be for easily 4 years from seed before you'll get a flower. Some species are really quick. like a lot of the asters are quick, penstemon are quick. This is the silky dogwood. And it's probably one of the fastest shrubs to grow from seed. So there's about, I don't know, 80 seedlings in this 8-inch pot that germinated. You know, this is pictures taken in June, so they've just been grown for a couple months. So I then took this whole pot and put it in a 2-gallon pot. And by the end of the summer, I had 18-inch long seedlings. And you could, let's say you wanted to put a hedge in, you could grow your hedge. And while they're growing in the pot over the summer, you could put down the cardboard with mulch on top in the area where you're going to plant this hedge. And then in the fall, go through and slice through that mulch and plant these seedlings out. And poof, you would have a really nice hedge. This is not rocket science. You know, this is something that all of us could be doing. I really hope all of you will go look at the Wild Seed Project website because it's a huge free resource. We're also a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a member-based organization. You become a member, you get a copy of our latest print publication. The last couple of years, we've done these great guides. This year, it's on native shrubs. And it would apply to you guys in the mid-Atlantic too. Last year we did native ground covers. The year before we did native trees, and they're these pocket guides. They're really nice. We also have a journal that we published before that called Wild Seed, and we still have copies of those for sale. Thank you, Jill. But the website is encyclopedic. There's lots of free information on it. So please, I really hope you'll go take a look at it. You know, our native plants are really losing their place in our world, and you can help. You know, we all need to change how we're caring for the land and getting more of these wild type native plants back in the landscape. And, you know, the biggest, you know, there's such a push now to get more native plants in the nursery trade, you know, but the reality is the genetically diverse wild type native plants, it's not the traditional nurseries who are going to pick up the slack in this. A lot of them aren't even propagators anymore. It is, you know, they don't even know how to sow the seeds anymore. There are, however, a lot of great upstart native nurseries. We have a great resource on our website called Where to Buy Native Plants that does include some down to your area, probably not as comprehensive as you guys would be able to figure out, but support these new growers who are doing it this way. And you can also do it yourself. It's a really fun, cheap, easy way to produce a lot of plants. You guys could have your Maryland, you know, you could have a plant sale in the fall with all the plants people produce. You know, let's create a different trajectory for our future. And sowing the native seeds is a very empowering thing to do. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have specific species that you're anxious to hear about, so I'm happy to hang around and answer more individual questions.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was great. And really quick, why don't you just say the website, just so we get it out there on record.
Okay, Wild Seed, if you just Google Wild Seed Project, but it's wildseedproject.net. But if you just do Wild Seed Project, it should come up.
Great.
It's really a beautiful website, you know, because so many people, you know, Maine is probably way behind you guys are in Maryland on the awareness of why native plants in landscapes matter. I think because it's a rural state with still a lot of nature, people, I don't know, Maine's very ahead in the, you know, organic gardening, organic food scene, but not in the native landscaping scene. And so a big focus with the organization was showing people. There are lots of blogs. Go read the different blogs, how-to blogs, how to grow milkweed from seed, just all these different topics, all the things that I've gotten a million questions of over the years. In fact, I realized when you were reading my bio, I need to update it with more years. I've been doing this specifically like this for 35 years and more than that, you know, like just, it's a beautiful website.
There's a ton of information, and I would recommend everybody to go check it out.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Heather. I learned so much. I can't remember most of it, but I wrote a lot down. I wanted to know about spice bush. Is that something that's easy to propagate to, I don't know about any seeds or flowers or anything, but I'm really interested in growing.
Yeah. Oh, I'd love to have more. Yeah. So those fruits turn from green to red, like in one day, and the birds appear in one day. So if you know where some spice bush is, and so in Massachusetts, those fruits are ripening through, I think, mid-August. So I don't know if they're earlier for you. So go watch, you know, that has separate male and female plants. So it's only going to have the fruits on them females, but just go look for the little green. It's maybe, you know, less than half an inch long and then green. And they're also hydrophilic. They cannot dry out. So as soon as they ripen, put them in a Ziploc bag, smush them, or you could squeeze the seed out if you wanted, and then sow them in a pot and put them in the shade, and they will germinate the next year. So they're not hard. They're a quicker one to grow from seed, but you have to have access to the fresh seed.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Great. And I'll just add, there's a recipe sort of for a soil mixture that you can make, that you can get from the website, that you know, buy your sand and.
Yeah, I like it. So a lot of potting soil, it's really great to cut it with some coarse sand, especially if you're growing like butterfly, any of the dryland plants. And it's where propagating in clay pots works better too, because especially the dry plants, they hate plastic. It doesn't breathe. And so if you're growing dryland plants, cut it by at least a third with coarse sand. I wrote an article in Horticulture magazine in like 1999, because when I was at Garden in the Woods, I wanted to make my own organic potting soil. And I wrote a great article in Horticulture magazine. I haven't seen it online, just on how to make your own potting soil, but you can use aged rotted bark, leaf mold, some compost, but cut it with some sand, or you can use some vermiculite or perlite. But sand is a great propagator's material, both for covering the seeds, because it lets light through. It also dries out more quickly than soil underneath. So you've sowed the seeds on the potting soil, then you put the sand on top. Let's say you're walking by your seed flats and you see the sand is lighter in color. You know how when it's dry, it looks lighter. It's like, you're like, I gotta go water it, but the seeds won't have dried out underneath. You know how with potting soil, when you sow it and then it starts to dry out, it's like too late by the time it dries out.
Mm-hmm.
Really appreciate your talk. I see a few shrubs around that are native, but I don't see any in my area. I don't see any wildflowers. It's suburban. It's very invaded with foreign plants and stuff. Where do I go to find the seeds?
Well, I suggest you can't just go collect seeds from anywhere. You know, you would have, if it's not your land, you need to ask permission. You need to first make sure you correctly identified the species. So you might, that's why we sell, you know, seeds that we've, you know, properly collected and handled on the Wild Seed Project website. So,
but I've been reading about the ecotypes, and you need to find ecotypes from your region, my own region.
yeah, I mean, you could go, you know, I don't know who's in your area. In Connecticut, that's a little closer than we are to you. There's
So you're saying just buy the seeds right now?
Well, if you don't own land, you've got to, you know.
I do own land, but I see spice bushes out there, I see all kinds of stuff, but I don't see flowers or native grasses with flowers much.
Mhm. Mhm. You know, like I said, I don't know, you can ask your local land trust. It really varies from place to place, whether you can, but a good protocol. So with collecting seed, first you want to find the plant when it's in bloom and make sure you correctly identify it and checked with your state natural areas that it's not listed as a rare and endangered species, because of course you can't do that. Then if it's then if it's not your land, you need to ask permission. So, some places let you, and then you need to do your homework to figure out when the seed is ripe. So it's one of the reasons to start sowing or buy some plants and plant them in their yard.
Oh, I have a huge wildflower meadow out there. I got most of the plants from people in Maryland will know, North Creek Nursery and so on, and I don't think they're the local ecotypes at all. So what I'm doing is I'm just propagating something that is not actually local to my district. I was just wondering how you go about.
I personally think we've just, for practicality, going a little farther, what you want to make sure is that you're getting genetically diverse seed that's from your eco region. It doesn't have to be your town. And in fact, with climate change, we're going to be Maryland, where I am, in the next couple decades. So I think the ecotype thing has gotten people really confused and paranoid. And what I'd really like to see is a focus on keeping the genetic diversity. And yes, anything that you can get from your region is great, but that's not always going to be practical. Like take Pacra, the golden groundsel, for instance. If you planted that in your yard from North Creek, there's a variety of that out that doesn't even produce viable seed. Like they clone a lot of their native stuff too. Or if you've ever wondered why you don't see any seed on your Phlox divaricata, because everybody has just a clone of one deeper blue cultivar. So you're going to have to start where you can start. So start with the shrubs then, or, find a common wildflower where you are allowed to collect the seeds and start with that.
Thank you.
There's also there's wild ones who do a lot of seed exchanges, and neighbors, I think, because I get a lot of my plants from my neighbors and they're happy for me. I wish you luck with that.
There are also some nurseries that do have local ecotypes in the Maryland area. So for instance, Earth Sangha only collects wild seed locally. Also Chesapeake Natives.
I got some from there.
Hope Farm?
Yes. And Ernst Seed, not Ernst Seeds, the
Arc Wild.
Yes, Arc Wild has it does local collections throughout the mid-Atlantic, but will identify which plants it has collected where. So you could just get plants that are native to your ecoregion. And their environmental concern has some local ecotypes. Kohler Nursery, although it also has non-natives or plants native to other areas. Stan Kohler, if you ask him, will tell you if he's collected the seed locally or not. So you can really ask at the various different nurseries. There are some nurseries listed on the Maryland Native Plant Society website. Those are going to be updated, but you can check with each of those at this point and see which grow local ecotypes. There are also lists for Virginia and other places of growers, and you can check with them. But at this point, there are a fair number of nurseries in Maryland and adjoining states that do grow at least some local ecotypes.
Okay, thank you very much, Dawn. Good question.
Thank you very much. I have a question about when all the plants have germinated in those small pots and then you plant them into the larger pot, and then later in the area where you want them to be, say for the homeowner, at any point do you split them all up and, you know,
You,
make them?
you can, and of course, if you're a commercial nursery, that is what you would do. However, by splitting them up, you do cause some like disturbance, and they'll often grow faster if you just move the whole group. If you feel like there are just so many in that little pot, you could divide that pot into 4 pieces and put it in 4 bigger pots. But I would not, typically with many species, not pull them out. You will just, they won't even miss a beat in their growth if you just move it to a bigger pot, versus if you divide them, you will, they'll have a little bit of shock with that. So it's so easy to just give it a much more space and let it grow on that way. But you can if you want to, but then you're gonna have like 50 little pots all over your house. So I'd say keep it in a bigger pot, or in a couple bigger pots.
And watering these things can get to be like.
Yeah, so the shade is the beauty, like, I have this passion for, my expertise is the woodland understory, and in the shade, the things that can grow in the shade all summer will need much less water than the ones in the sun. If you're going away, even the sun loving ones, if you're going away for a couple days, you could put them in a shadier spot for a couple days and it won't bother them that much. But yes, but if you plant them out in the landscape, the most likely you'll forget where you put them. They'll get overtaken by weeds or they'll dry out. I just promise you, it works really well to wait and plant them out in the fall. And instead, prepare your site and go do fun things in the summer.
Yeah, I love it. It sounds like you're someone who likes to have a life. Okay, Kelly, is that all you needed?
Yes, well, I have another quick question.
Okay.
Is there a book available with this information in it?
Well, there's lots, like I said, it's in various places on the Wild Seed Project website. For instance, like I did a manual for the Maine DOT that has propagation information on 35 species of shrubs and roadside wildflowers. There's a bunch of different blogs on it, but no, there's not one book that will do everything. My favorite propagation books are Native Trees by Henry Koch, Growing Native Trees and Shrubs by Seed. And then Bill Kalina, who was also at Native Plant Trust, his different propagation books are good. And then also sometimes finding some older ones too, but there's no one. I use Michael Durr's reference manual to woody plant propagation. That was written in the 70s. That's what I learned on. It includes, back then nurseries still grew from seed, so he has a lot of information on growing them from seed. He also talks about the promise of cloning and tissue culture. So there's that information too, but so there's no one book that will solve everything.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Good question. All right, Lauren.
Hi there, Heather. Thank you. That was fabulous. I just wanted to share a couple things. So I'll encourage everyone, when you're out shopping, even if you go to a regular nursery, and even though you know you won't get a local ecotype, ask them for it. Let's push for that, right? So the more we ask, maybe we'll get there faster. So that's just a little comment. I've actually got a little native nursery on my property that I'm growing mostly for my own self because I'm trying to do my entire property in local ecotype, and I have 3 acres, and it's completely ridiculous. I will tell you, it's a lot of nuts and messiness and things die and whatever, but it's not that hard, and everybody should try this. I was lucky enough, probably about, I think 7 or 8 years ago, I went to a seed propagation workshop by Bill Kleina. It was up living on Long Island at the time in New York. And, you know, it was really this simple thing of like Heather was talking about seeds with fruits that generally the bigger ones, usually you have to put in the ground right away. And, you know, you kind of will get the hang of it as you do this a little bit, that there's these general categories. I find a quick, easy reference is Prairie Moon. They have actually a pretty nice website. So if you're looking at some seed and you're like, I can't remember what to do about this, look it up on Prairie Moon, and they have a nice little germination code worked out for most things. So that will get you a quick answer most of the time. Hard lessons for me have been critter control. They dig, even though they're not eating the seeds, the squirrels dig up my pots in order to bury the acorns. So you get an acorn in the pot of the other thing that you're trying to grow, which is very annoying. So stuff like that. So, you know, have a little bit of area that you could screen off or something that really helps to control. And I'm trying to move towards a shade cloth because the summer, we were talking about that, the summer watering and all that, getting into bigger pots makes things easier for watering. So there's just some stuff like that that just makes your life a little bit easier as I've done this for a while. And then this whole discussion about where to get the seeds. The way I've been getting most of mine is I will buy at least 3 and preferably more plants from a place like Earth Sangha or Chesapeake Natives. If I don't have it, like some things are on my property or somebody I know that has some property or something, but if I can't get seed collected, I'll buy from a source that is local ecotype and I'll grow out of that. So I'll grow those plants and know where they are and know which ones they are and collect the seeds and then start propagating.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that when you're buying plants, get 2 or 3 at least so that you have healthy cross-pollination. You know, don't just buy one of each thing.
Right. And, you know, these places that are collecting like that, they have permits. They're all nonprofits pretty much, and they are out there collecting in some wild space. And there are protocols to collect to get that broad genetic diversity so that hopefully they're capturing a pretty good array of the genetic diversity within the population. Just having 3 plants, of course, you're going to lose some of that, but at least that's better than the cloned tissue culture version or whatever, or, you know, unfortunately, I think I'm going to be a little bit harsh on North Creek. I suspect that they probably have a limited thing that they start with and they keep growing it the same one out all the time. So if we can put into our yards this more diverse set, it's going to help, even if it's not perfect. And with shrubs, you know, the challenge, as we're hearing, is they take a long time. So even if you did a cutting on a native ecotype shrub, it's going to be still probably better than going to some nursery where they're all the same, right? So, and some shrubs are very easy. I did Virginia sweet spire this year. That was super easy from cuttings. Really, like I stuffed the stick in the pot and forgot about it for 6 months, and it's just doing great, you know. And then, but it is in a caged area from deer. And then I have all the viburnums tend to be pretty easy too, and the dogwoods tend to be somewhat easy. It depends on the dogwood, but they, you know, these things can grow fairly easily sometimes from a cutting. So that might be a quick way if you can't wait for the seed thing to grow. So those are just some quick ways to help you kick your work along. And then for people who are thinking about this, you might want to go visit Ursenga just to see what that setup looks like, right? Because they have all their little their mist emitters, their shade cloth, like the actual way to do it that's on scale like that. If you want to kind of get a handle on what that looks like, you can walk around and see their setup. I think I haven't been to Chesapeake Natives in a while, so I'm not sure, but Ursang has been around a long time, and they've really kind of worked it out, very efficiently. So I thought that would be helpful for people. And we need more growers. We have a shortage in the area of native plants right now. I do design and work with installers, and we can't get plants. The South had a warm winter and bought all the supplies out. We need more plants. We need more people to do this in a larger scale, even if you're not doing it in your backyard, we need like farmer people to be doing this to get the kind of plants that we need to really get the job done. So
Yeah, good points, Lauren. Thank you.
yeah, thank you, Heather. That was amazing.
I want to let our speaker go, but I did have one quick question myself, Heather. What sort of area do you have to work with in your yard? Do you have a bunch of tables, or do you grow things near the ground, or how much space do you use for your own operation? What do you have?
Well, I live in Portland in town. I have a bigger yard than normal, but no, that's the beauty of, like I said, just for yourself. You don't need a lot of space at all. I do those pots. I have a brick terrace area that I put those pots, and I got my husband to make me some nice wooden frames with the wire mesh on the bottom and on the top. So I have a lot, but then it invariably spills out and goes, all over the place. But so that's the beauty. You can grow a lot for yourself at home, and you don't need a lot of space, and help scale up that way. You'll end up with too many, and you'll have to share them with someone else. So that's like and also when you sow those seeds in this controlled nursery environment, then like broadcasting seeds, almost all the seeds will become plants. So all that genetic diversity in that pinch of seeds will get to live, versus in nature, most the fate of a seed is not to become an adult, like it's 1 in a million. But we can, and because we're in a crisis with our planet, we can take our small amount of native plants and build them up. And lots of people doing this is how to get there while we wait for the nurseries to get their act together. So, like you can be proactive and get going, and it's cheap.
Yeah, and if you have extras, you can advertise it in your neighborhood and, give or sell if you wanted to sell $1 a piece, or, something like that. Get them out in your neighborhood and encourage your neighbors to plant them. But okay, I think we should let Heather go. Thank you so much. It was a fantastic talk. Lots of great resources on your website, as you mentioned, and I would recommend everyone go to the website. There's a lot of really good information on the website, and if you become just a subscriber and or a member, you get notified of workshops. I noticed you all had one recently about growing native plants. So
yeah, anybody can just sign to be part of our e-news. Okay. If you become a member, then you automatically get the latest publication and some discounts and stuff. But anybody can just sign, to, get our mail or emailing list and stuff. So
great. Okay, well, hopefully, like next year, when we talk to you sometime, we'll tell you all of our great progress that we've made. So thank you very, very much, Heather, and thank you all the audience out there for participating. Great questions, and really appreciate you joining us tonight. So collect those seeds and get those pots potted up and start growing things.